On November 18, 1952, a 27-year-old Navy pilot found himself alone in the sky with 7 Soviet fighter jets. What happened next would become the longest dogfight in U.S. Navy history. 35 minutes of aerial combat against the most advanced fighters in the world. By the time it was over, 4 Soviet pilots were dead, and Lieutenant Royce Williams had 263 bullet holes in his aircraft. But here's where the story takes a turn that seems almost impossible to believe. When Williams landed, he was pulled into a classified briefing. He was told he had just engaged the actual Soviet Air Force, not North Koreans, not Chinese volunteers, but pilots flying directly out of Vladivostok. And then he was given an order: tell no one, not his squadron mates, not his family, not even his wife. For more than 50 years, he kept that promise. By late 1952, the Korean War had ground into a bloody stalemate. The initial drama, the surprise invasion, MacArthur's brilliant Incheon landing, the Chinese intervention, had given way to something grimmer, a war of attrition along the 38th parallel, with casualties mounting and no end in sight. Back home, Americans were losing interest. This wasn't World War II. There were no ticker tape parades, no clear enemy, no obvious path to victory. Korea would later be called the Forgotten War, and even while it was happening, it was already fading from the headlines. But for the men fighting it, the war was very real. Lieutenant Royce Williams had grown up in Wilmot, South Dakota, a small town where his father ran a grocery store. His father had served in the First World War, and Williams wanted to follow in his footsteps. He'd later recall his childhood fondly: the openness, neighbors looking after one another, learning to swim and shoot, playing cowboys and Indians until the streetlights came on. It was a world away from where he found himself now, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Oriskany, part of Task Force 77, operating in the frigid waters of the Sea of Japan just off the North Korean coast. Williams flew the Grumman F-9 F-5 Panther, a capable jet that had proven itself in ground attack missions. But against the Soviet MiG-15, the Panther was outclassed in almost every way that mattered. The MiG was faster, could climb higher, and could outmaneuver the American jets in a vertical fight. Navy pilots knew this. They'd been told in stark terms that if they encountered MiGs, the odds were not in their favor. That morning, Williams woke to a blustery snowstorm. Visibility was poor, maybe 2 or 3 miles, with a 500-foot ceiling. Not ideal flying weather, but operations continued. The day began with a strike mission against industrial targets at Hworyong, a North Korean city uncomfortably close to the Soviet border. The carriers had positioned themselves near Chongjin, within easy striking distance of Soviet bases at Vladivostok. Everyone knew this was provocative. Everyone knew the Soviets were watching. Williams flew the first strike of the day. It went smoothly. He landed, grabbed something to eat, and was told to get ready for another mission, a combat air patrol to protect the task force. At this point, Williams probably felt the familiar mix of fatigue and alertness that comes from sustained combat operations. He'd been doing this for weeks. The routine was becoming second nature: brief, launch, fly, land, repeat. 4 Panther jets launched into the snowstorm that afternoon. Williams was section leader. The plan was simple: patrol the airspace between the carrier group and any potential threats from the north. They climbed through the clouds, instruments only, until they broke out at around 12,000 feet. And that's when Williams looked up. High above them, at 40,000 to 50,000 feet, he could see contrails, 7 of them, heading south. MiGs. What happened next would determine whether Williams lived or died. The flight leader, Lieutenant Claire Elwood, reported a warning light. His fuel pump was failing. He had no choice but to turn back to the carrier. His wingman, Lieutenant John Middleton, went with him as escort, standard procedure. That left 2 American jets against 7 MiGs. Williams and his wingman, Lieutenant Dave Rowlands, continued climbing toward the contact. They reached 26,000 feet. The MiGs, now identified clearly as Soviet aircraft by their distinctive silhouettes, split into 2 formations. 4 of them dove toward the American jets from 10 o'clock. 3 more swept around from the other side. They were being boxed in. The MiGs opened fire first. Williams saw tracers streaking past his canopy, some over, some under. In that moment, there was no time for fear. Training took over. He got on the radio. The carrier was ordering them not to engage. Williams' response was simple: "I am engaged." There was no choice now. The MiGs were faster. If he tried to run, they'd catch him and kill him. The only way out was through. Williams pulled his Panther into the fight. He fired a burst at the trailing MiG in the Soviet formation and connected. The aircraft began smoking and dropped away. Rollins followed the crippled MiG down, trying to get his guns to fire, but they jammed. He gave up at 8,000 feet and began the long climb back up. But by then, Williams was alone. 6 Soviet jets, 1 American. 35 minutes of combat. What followed was a masterclass in survival. Williams couldn't outrun the MiGs. He couldn't outclimb them. But the Panther had one advantage: it could turn. And Williams used every bit of that capability. He described it later with remarkable understatement. A lot of it was awareness of where they were and how I had to maneuver to avoid them. They were taking turns. I decided if I concentrated on shooting them down, then I'd become an easy target. So my initial goal was to look for defensive opportunities when they made mistakes. Defensive opportunities. As if this were a chess game, not a fight to the death at 400 miles per hour. The MiGs came at him in waves. Williams would turn into each attack, denying them a clean shot, then look for openings when they overshot or misjudged their approach. When he saw a chance, he fired. Short, controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. A second MiG went down, then a third. Each kill bought him seconds, but there were always more. At some point during the fight, it's impossible to know exactly when, Williams was probably running on pure adrenaline. 35 minutes doesn't sound long, but in aerial combat, it's an eternity. The physical demands alone are punishing. Constant high-G maneuvers, head on a swivel, hands and feet working controls with precision while your body is thrown against the harness. And the mental load, tracking multiple aircraft, calculating angles, managing fuel and ammunition, making split-second decisions that mean life or death. That takes a toll that doesn't show up on any instrument panel. Then the MiGs finally got him. Williams had a 4th MiG smoking and descending when a 37mm cannon round punched through his wing and into the engine. Warning lights lit up across his panel. He'd lost his rudder and flaps entirely. Only the elevators and partial aileron control remained. The aircraft fought him with every input. But the 4th MiG was done, and Williams was still flying. Williams dove for the clouds with a MiG on his tail, still firing. At that moment, Rollins, who had spent the fight climbing back from 8,000 feet, finally rejoined. He came in on the pursuing MiG, and it broke off. Other American aircraft were being vectored toward the area. The remaining Soviets disengaged. Williams emerged from the cloud layer at just 400 feet, too low to eject if something else went wrong. His aircraft was barely controllable. He had no rudder, no flaps. He was out of ammunition. And he was surrounded by American warships that didn't know he was coming. The task force's radar operators saw an aircraft approaching from the direction of the Soviet Union. They did what they were trained to do. They opened fire. Williams, having just survived 35 minutes of combat with Soviet MiGs, now found himself dodging anti-aircraft fire from his own fleet. He made it through, just. The landing was controlled chaos. With almost no flight controls, Williams had to muscle the Panther onto the deck. He caught the wire and came to a stop. When the plane captain climbed up to the cockpit, Williams probably sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, before the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They counted the holes in his aircraft, 263. Williams never saw his Panther again. The gun camera footage, which would have documented exactly what he had done, was confiscated and never resurfaced. As for the aircraft itself, the historical record is murky. Williams and others reported it was pushed over the side, but Navy logs suggest a plane with that serial number flew until 1959. Either way, the evidence of what happened that day was made to disappear. Williams was immediately summoned to a debriefing aboard the fleet flagship. There, he met with Admiral Robert Briscoe, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Far East, and representatives from an agency so new it barely existed, the National Security Agency. They told him what he had suspected. The pilots he'd fought weren't North Koreans or Chinese. They were actual Soviet Air Force pilots, flying directly out of Vladivostok. But there was more. An NSA team aboard the cruiser USS Helena had been monitoring Soviet radio traffic, and they'd intercepted the order sending the MiGs south. That's how the task force had known they were coming before they arrived. If the full story ever became public, any investigation might reveal how the Americans had advance warning. And if the Soviets realized their communications were being intercepted, they'd change their codes and frequencies, and a critical intelligence advantage would be lost. And there was an even larger concern. The Cold War was balanced on a knife's edge. The American public, already frustrated with Korea, might demand retaliation if they learned Soviet pilots had attacked U.S. aircraft. Politicians might feel pressure to escalate. The situation could spiral toward World War III. So the decision was made. The entire incident would be erased. Williams was awarded the Silver Star, but his citation said he'd shot down one enemy aircraft and damaged another. No mention of Soviets, no mention of 4 kills. The other pilots in the fight were given partial credit for his victories to spread the story across multiple less remarkable encounters. And Williams was told, in no uncertain terms, to never speak of what had happened. Not to his squadron mates, not to his brother, who was also a Navy pilot, not to his wife. A few weeks later, President-elect Dwight Eisenhower visited Korea. He asked to meet Williams privately. Over drinks in Seoul, surrounded by generals, Bradley, Clark, Van Fleet, Eisenhower thanked him. They explained how important it was, Williams recalled, that no one ever know about the fight with the Russians. Williams agreed, and for the next 50 years, he kept his word. Try to imagine carrying that secret. Williams went on to fly 70 combat missions in Korea and another 110 in Vietnam. He flew A-4 Skyhawks and F-4 Phantoms. He commanded ships. He earned 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and other commendations. He served 37 years in the Navy, retiring as a captain in 1980. And through all of it, through promotions and reassignments, through wars and peacetime, through decades of marriage and raising 3 sons, he never said a word. His wife didn't know. His brother, the Navy pilot who would have understood better than anyone, didn't know. When people thanked him for his service, Williams smiled and said thank you for letting him serve. He never mentioned that he'd single-handedly shot down 4 Soviet jets. What does that do to a person? We can only guess. Williams, characteristically, doesn't dwell on it. When asked later, he simply said, "I had been warned, informed, told not to talk about it." Even that is a direct order. I didn't talk to anybody, including my wife. The silence only broke because the Soviet Union collapsed. In the early 1990s, Russian archives began opening. Military historians gained access to records that had been classified for decades. And in those records was an account of November 18, 1952, from the Soviet perspective. Of the 7 MiG-15s that flew out of Vladivostok that morning, only 1 returned. 4 were shot down by Williams. A 5th crashed on the way back to base. The 6th was never found. Russian historian Igor Sadov documented the engagement in his 2014 book, naming the 4 pilots Williams had killed: Captain Belyakov, Captain Vandalov, Lieutenant Pakomkin, and Lieutenant Tarshinov. Somewhere around 2002, Williams received word that the incident had been declassified. He could finally talk about it. The first person he told was his wife. In January 2023, more than 70 years after the dogfight, Royce Williams received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest award for valor. He was 97 years old. The push for the Medal of Honor continues. The main obstacle is almost absurd. The true story of the dogfight was systematically hidden. Official U.S. records from 1952 credit Williams with 1 kill and 1 damaged aircraft against vaguely identified enemy planes. The Soviet involvement was scrubbed entirely. The full truth only survived in Russian archives. As of this recording, Williams is 100, and legislation to finally authorize the award is awaiting the president's signature. When asked about the recognition, he's been characteristically modest. "People say thank you for your service. I say thank you for letting me serve." A fellow fighter pilot once compared what Williams did to throwing himself on a grenade. "Except," he said, "Royce Williams threw himself on a grenade and lived." But surviving the combat was only half of it. He also survived 50 years of silence. 50 years of knowing what he'd done and being unable to tell anyone. Not his wife, not his brother, not anyone. He never complained, never leaked, never sought credit. He simply did what he was ordered to do, first in the sky, and then for the rest of his life. The MiG-15 was supposed to be invincible in 1950. Royce Williams proved it wasn't. And then, because his country asked him to, he let the world forget.